I wasn't prepared to concisely answer the question, but I also feel like if I had brought any one of those three things up without a little bit of explanation, it would have just been like, politics. Boom, you suck.
Yeah. Well, hello and welcome back to Midweek Mashup. This is our opportunity for our folks online to connect with our pastors in person.
Yeah.
Welcome back, Pastor Eric. Yeah. Talking this week about gospel reconstruction after we totally obliterated evangelism last week with gospel deconstruction.
Yep.
What did we kind of talk about this week? What is gospel reconstruction? Why do we need to reconstruct the gospel?
I think there's two answers to that. The first one is we always need to be interpreting the gospel in light of our context and cultural surroundings. And when I say that, and sometimes people push back against that and say, well, the gospel is the gospel, and I'll be like, cool. Let me give you a Greek Bible and you then tell me what the gospel is, right? No, it had to be reinterpreted into English. Even concepts that existed in a Jewish or a Greco-Roman culture 2,000 years ago don't quite translate. And so we have to always be going back, trying to figure out what did the gospel mean in its original context to its original hearers, and then helping us filter through that our own context so that it makes sense, right? Good news is not so much good news to people if they can't understand or apply it, right? And so that's a thing that even at the Reformation, there was this concept of we should always be reforming. Martin Luther didn't discover a pure religion that never existed before and then it never changes again. No, he looked at what was going on in his context and applied what Scripture said to it, and that's where the Reformation kind of took root. So, there are certain Reformed theologians who would say that we always need to be reforming, and I think that's actually pretty helpful, and not be stuck in the 1500s and their understanding of faith in their context. So we always need to be reconstructing the gospel in a way that makes sense for our place in our time, and I think that's a helpful way of thinking about it. The other piece of it is that what happens when we talked about deconstruction, it's like what happens when things get added to the gospel in a way that's maybe not in line with Scripture or maybe not on the level of importance of the gospel. And what things do we need to pick apart and then be able to rebuild from there? Yeah. And so restructuring the gospel is our way of saying it's one thing to blow something up because it needs certain things dismantled, but then there has to be this process of building something in its place. So long answer, two reasons for gospel reconstruction. It's we always need to be reforming, but we also need to recognize when we've brought some extra stuff along with us that can be left behind so that we have a better understanding and application of the gospel, then that's also a really good, healthy process. So, yeah.
That's so cool. As you're kind of explaining this a little bit, what kind of comes to mind is how Jesus kind of instituted the church through his disciples, apostles. Yeah. And then as Paul went around and kind of planted these churches, he then wrote the epistles, which is kind of its own sort of reformation of like, hey, here's the things that you've kind of gotten off track a little bit with. Yeah. Let's course correct. And then, of course, Martin Luther, the Reformation from the Catholic Church, and saying, hey, let's move away from some of these things. This might be a little bit of a hot topic, but but if we took the American church today and you just had to speculate about what some Reformation sort of topics would be that need to be deconstructed and reconstructed.
Yeah, if we were going to nail some theses to the door like Luther did.
What would be important for our viewers of this midweek mashup to kind of reflect on what are some of the things that we may have gotten off track about?
Yeah, that's great. The first thing that comes to mind is attaching our brand of politics to the Christian faith, and I've said this before in sermons and maybe even on these midweek mashups that I've heard way too many people say, you can't follow Jesus and vote for this party. Now, I come from a more, conservative background, and the people who initially discipled me were more conservative. And so I remember them saying something similar, maybe not that extreme, but something similar to me. And then finding faithful Christians who aren't conservative politically, who are living out their faith in a way that seems to be faithful to Jesus, but would not maybe vote for those people or subscribe to those politics. And so if that's us, if that's our church or people in our church, we have to separate partisan politics from our faith. It doesn't mean we become apolitical. It doesn't mean that we don't care about politics. It's that we have to engage in politics in a different way, not on the terms that the world tells us we have to. And there are even sometimes we have to say, like, the binary you're calling me, the left or the right or the Democrat or the Republican, I don't think either party gets it right. And so I'm not actually going to engage on these terms anymore. And I want to offer maybe a different solution or a different way of thinking through that. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. It's one of the number one reasons that people do deconstruct their faith, or younger generations stay completely away from the church because they see this unhealthy marriage between politics and religion, and so the reason that comes to mind first is just simply because of that. It's just done so much damage. I also think that we elevate certain kind of moral positions over others. And, if you emphasize the moral issues that are important to me, then you're the good kind of Christian. And if you don't emphasize those things, or you emphasize other things in their place, then you may be a Christian, but you're not the right kind of Christian. And so we get this oftentimes, and it's a similar kind of dichotomy to the political conversation, where you get this crowd over here that's saying, no, individual morality and personal responsibility issues are the moral issues that Jesus cares about. So if you're a true Christian, you're worried about such things. And then you have folks from a different perspective who would say, no, righteousness and justice are not just individual issues, they're systemic issues, and so we need to build structures that sow righteousness and justice into our culture. Both are right. Both are true, and they really need to go hand in hand. And so what does it look like for a church to apply the gospel to everyday life? What that's going to look like is a group of Christians who take seriously their personal responsibility to do what's right. But they also take their responsibility to their greater community to say, how do we bring Jesus-shaped righteousness and justice into the common sphere? This is one of those things that I think really deserves to be planted on. The word righteousness in the Bible is not about individual holiness. It's actually a communal word. And God's own righteousness is described not as some eternal quality that he has, though we can certainly say it is, but his righteousness is actually described in his treatment of us, that he acts rightly toward us. That's his righteousness. And in the same way, righteousness is not about personal holiness or sin management. It's actually about what do we do with one another. And so the two have to go hand in hand. People do need to be pursuing a personal kind of righteousness or a right way of aligning themselves with Christ, but that's going to make itself into communal righteousness. That was a bit of a sidetrack, but the reason I think that's so important is that when we talk about the gospel, we're not talking about a set of facts that kind of floats in the clouds and one day it'll mean something for us. No, it matters in our day-to-day life. And so for people to believe good news in our context and culture, they're going to need to see good news, and they're going to need to see Christians who are not just sitting on the sideline, just, personal piety, it's me and Jesus. They're going to need to see people making a difference in the community, sowing righteousness into the community. So that's a piece of it that I think the church needs to be confronted with. Christianity is not just an individualistic thing between you and the Lord. We need to see a movement of righteousness, of making right relationships with people, not just with God. And I could do this probably all day. I don't know if I have 95 theses like Martin Luther had, but there, it's we've got a long history of church in America, and so you're going to see things that that you could always do better, right? And so I think the last the last thing I'll say on this, because I don't want to take up everybody's entire day, is this sense of consumerism with which we can approach Christianity. I remember, when I first learned about the seeker-sensitive movement, and I remember thinking, well, that comes from a really good place. Like, we are not content to just say, hey, we're going to keep our faith to ourselves. We want to make space for people who need to hear the gospel, experience the gospel. But the unfortunate thing that I think happened with the seeker-sensitive movement is it became this thing of like, we are going to put on a show, and this attractional mindset, and we are going to entertain people, and we're going to move people with this experience that we create for them. And that doesn't come from like a movement in the like mid 1900s, even though that's when we start to see it take shape in the forms that we see it now. This is something that happens all the way back in these things called the Great Awakenings and these revival movements that happened in American church history, where all of the sudden, people were repenting of their sins, and these revival things. Prayer movements were breaking out. People were repenting and turning their lives around and getting serious about their faith again. Our modern kind of seeker-sensitive or evangelical worship service is basically like taking a revival and the elements of a revival type of service and making that our every Sunday thing with the expectation that it's going to, and I'm using extreme language here, so you can email Matt if you don't like it. I'm using extreme language here, but in a caricature of it, you're whipping people into an emotional frenzy so that they will make a emotional decision in that moment and hope it sticks. And if we just do that every week, when are we going to build a foundation of faith? When are we going to do, what the older churches church movements call catechesis? When do we actually help these people put the building blocks of their faith so that they've got something more sustainable, more foundational than just an emotional experience that they have? So I have a lot of critiques for those revival movements in their time because, for example, some of the great revival movements are associated with a guy like Jonathan Edwards. And I would go so far as to say any revival that stirred up all this emotion and spiritual fervor that did not result in radical change, such as freeing your slaves, I would say that revival was kind of a little emotional experience that didn't lead towards much else. And if you're Jonathan Edwards lover out there, I apologize. I would say that an awakening should include that kind of radical transformation in the way that you see others made in the image of God. And then what does that do? What is your action? This is a really long answer. I'm sorry. So in the same way, our worship services today, if they whip people into an emotion and they feel like, I heard a good sermon that encouraged me and I loved that song, it really inspired me, but it doesn't build people up as disciples with some sort of strategic focus, some sort of understanding what discipleship is that's built into our weekend services, then I think we're missing the mark on what church is meant to be. So to summarize, because I just said a lot of things, I think the marriage with partisan politics is something that the church needs to really take a hard look at and be run away from. I think the idea of individualism, that church is about me having a right relationship with God is good, but it needs to be balanced with we need right relationships with our world and our culture. That's what biblical righteousness and justice look like. And then the last one, we can't just kind of sit around, entertain ourselves, make ourselves feel good about ourselves with some revivalistic religious services. We need to chart a course for what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, and then actually give people steps to take to do it, and then hold them accountable to take those steps. Like we mean it when we say that this matters, and so let's do it. Let's commit to it. So those are 3 things. I could rant and rave about this all day, but I think those would be 3 big steps. If the American church moved in those directions, man, we'd see a lot of healing and reconciliation and healthy gospel reconstruction that leads to legit revival, and it also welcomes in people who never saw the church as an option because they see some of our hypocrisy in these things, and they're like, I don't want anything to do with that.
Well, we may not see a 95 Theses being published, but maybe somewhere in the upper 30s at some point.
There you go.
But thank you so much for sitting down with us and giving us some insight on where, just from your perspective, the church is at right now, and some things we should be looking out for. And
thank you, and to all the viewers for letting me rant.
Yeah. Deconstruction, reconstruction, it's things that we should be talking about, and we shouldn't avoid it as a subject.
Agreed.
But if you want to hear more from Pastor Eric about deconstruction and then reconstruction, I'll go ahead and add a banner to this week's sermon. You can go ahead and check it out. But until next week, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll catch you in the next one.